He pushed his pregnant wife down the stairs and thought he'd gotten away with murder. But what he didn't know was that she'd been secretly documenting everything. Every threat, every assault, every lie. And when the truth exploded into public view, it revealed something far darker than anyone imagined. This is the story that had an entire city demanding justice. If you're ready for a tale of survival, revenge, and redemption, smash that like button and subscribe because you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Drop a comment if you've ever felt powerless and found your strength. Here we go. The fluorescent lights of Metro General Hospital hummed overhead as Trevor Caldwell sat beside his wife's hospital bed, one hand clutching hers while the other scrolled through his phone. To anyone watching through the glass partition, he looked like the picture of a devoted husband keeping vigil over his pregnant wife. But Trevor wasn't reading messages of concern. He was texting his mistress. "Almost over," he typed. "She won't wake up for hours. Meet me at the apartment at 10. Grace Holloway lay motionless in the bed, her 29-year-old face pale against the stark white pillows. Medical equipment surrounded her like a fortress of beeping machines and coiled tubes. At 6 months pregnant, her belly rose beneath a thin hospital blanket. The monitors tracking her baby's heartbeat provided the only sound of life in the sterile room. Detective Ryan Shaw stood outside the room, arms crossed, studying Trevor through the glass. Something felt wrong. The fall Grace supposedly took down their home staircase didn't match the injury pattern. Ryan had worked enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs. 6 hours earlier, Grace had been laughing with colleagues at the precinct, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. She was one of the best detectives on the force, known for her calm demeanor under pressure and her ability to talk down even the most volatile suspects. Everyone admired her. Everyone thought she had the perfect life. They were all wrong. The truth was hidden beneath long sleeves in summer heat, concealed under carefully applied makeup, buried behind forced smiles when colleagues asked if she was okay. Grace Holloway was dying inside her own home, and the only person who saw her suffering was the man who caused it. Her father, Police Chief Marshall Holloway, had no idea. In his mind, Trevor was the successful investment banker who had swept his daughter off her feet 3 years ago. Charming, educated, from a good family. Marshall had given them his blessing without hesitation. Now Grace hung between life and death because of that blessing. Ryan's phone buzzed. A text from the emergency room doctor. Patient stabilized, severe head trauma consistent with blunt force. Injuries inconsistent with simple fall. Thought you should know. Ryan's jaw tightened. He'd suspected as much. He pushed through the door into Grace's room. Trevor looked up, instantly transforming his expression into one of concern. "Any news, Detective Shaw?" "The doctors say she's stable." Ryan replied, his tone neutral. "For now, thank God." Trevor stood, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair. The gesture looked rehearsed. "I still can't believe this happened. 1 minute we were talking, the next she was tumbling down the stairs. It all happened so fast." Ryan watched him carefully. "What were you talking about?" Trevor hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Wedding anniversary plans. Next month marks 3 years." He glanced at Grace with what looked like affection, but felt calculated. "I wanted to take her somewhere special before the baby comes." "That's nice," Ryan said, though his instincts screamed otherwise. "I'll need to ask you some questions about the accident. Standard procedure." "Of course. Anything to help." Trevor checked his watch. "Though I'd prefer to stay with Grace if possible. It'll only take a few minutes." Before Trevor could respond, the door burst open. Police Chief Marshall Holloway filled the doorway, his 58-year-old frame still imposing despite the gray in his hair. His face was ashen, eyes wild with fear. "Grace," he breathed, rushing to his daughter's bedside. "My God, what happened?" Trevor immediately shifted into concerned son-in-law mode. "Marshall, I'm so sorry, but it was an accident. She lost her balance on the stairs. I tried to catch her, but..." His voice broke convincingly. "I couldn't reach her in time." Marshall gripped his daughter's hand, his own trembling. Grace was his only child. Raised alone after her mother died when she was 12, he'd devoted his life to her, taught her everything he knew about justice and duty. Now she lay broken before him. "The baby," Marshall's voice cracked. "Stable. Ryan interjected. Both of them are holding on. Marshall nodded, unable to speak. He leaned down and kissed Grace's forehead. I'm here, sweetheart. Dad's here. You're going to be okay. Ryan watched the scene, his detective's mind cataloging details. Trevor's performance was too smooth, too practiced. Marshall's grief was raw and real. And Grace, silent in her hospital bed, held secrets that Ryan intended to uncover. Because somewhere in this room was a truth that would shock the entire city. 24 hours before the fall, Grace had stood in her kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner with mechanical precision. The knife moved rhythmically against the cutting board, each slice a meditation that kept her mind from wandering to dangerous thoughts. Trevor would be home soon. She needed everything perfect. The house they lived in was a gift from Marshall, a beautiful craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood where children played in yards and neighbors waved to each other. Behind its charming facade, Grace lived in a prison. Her phone vibrated on the counter. A text from her colleague, Detective Sarah Mitchell. Drinks after shift tomorrow. You look like you could use a break. Grace stared at the message. How could she explain that she couldn't go anywhere without Trevor's permission? That casual drinks with friends had become another thing she'd lost. She deleted the message without responding. The front door opened. Grace's shoulders tensed automatically, a conditioned response she hated herself for having. She listened to Trevor's footsteps, trying to gauge his mood by the weight of his stride. Grace, his voice was neutral. That was good. Neutral meant safe, at least for now. In the kitchen, she called back, forcing brightness into her tone. Trevor appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie. At 34, he was objectively handsome, with sharp features and the kind of confidence that came from private schools and family money. Grace used to find that confidence attractive. Now it terrified her. Something smells good, he said, moving behind her to peer at the stove. Chicken piccata, your favorite, Im. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his hands resting on her pregnant belly. To anyone watching, it would have looked tender. Grace knew better. His grip was just tight enough to remind her who was in control. How was work? She asked, keeping her voice light. Stressful. The Parker account is demanding revisions again. His hands tightened slightly. I could use some peace and quiet tonight. Translation. Don't upset me. Of course, Grace murmured. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. He released her and headed upstairs. Grace exhaled slowly, her hands shaking as she continued cooking. This was her life now, walking on eggshells, reading moods, making herself smaller and quieter to avoid triggering his anger. 6 months ago, she'd discovered she was pregnant. For one brief, foolish moment, she'd thought it would change things, that becoming parents would soften Trevor, remind him of the man he'd pretended to be when they first met. Instead, it had made everything worse. Trevor resented the pregnancy, resented her changing body, resented the attention she received as an expectant mother. He'd started staying out late, coming home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. When she'd found the credit card charges for luxury hotels, she'd made the mistake of asking about them. That night, he'd grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the kitchen wall. You don't question me, he'd hissed, his face inches from hers. Ever. Do you understand? She'd nodded, unable to speak, with his hand crushing her windpipe. When he released her, she'd collapsed to the floor, gasping, cradling her belly protectively. Trevor had stepped over her without another word. The next morning, he'd acted as if nothing had happened, made her coffee, kissed her cheek, reminded her they had brunch with her father that weekend. Grace had worn a turtleneck to hide the bruises. Now, as she plated dinner with careful precision, Grace caught her reflection in the kitchen window. She barely recognized herself. The confident detective who'd graduated top of her academy class had been replaced by a hollow-eyed woman who flinched at sudden movements. How had she let this happen? The question haunted her constantly. She was trained to recognize abuse, to help victims escape dangerous situations. Yet here she was, trapped in the same pattern she'd rescued countless others from. Shame kept her silent. Shame and fear and the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. How could she tell her father that his hand-picked son-in-law was destroying her? How could she face her colleagues knowing she'd been too weak, too stupid, too blind to see what Trevor really was? Trevor returned downstairs wearing casual clothes, his hair still damp from a shower. He sat at the dining table, checking his phone while Grace served dinner. "Looks great," he said absently, not looking up from his screen. They ate in silence. Grace pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. The baby kicked, a small flutter that usually brought her joy. Tonight it felt like a reminder of how trapped she was. "I need to go out after dinner," Trevor announced, still focused on his phone. "Some client emergency." Grace knew better than to believe him. She also knew better than to challenge him. "Okay, well," she said quietly. He glanced up, studying her face. "You're not going to ask where I'm going." It was a test. They both knew it. "I trust you," Grace lied. Trevor smiled, satisfied. "Good girl." The patronizing words made her stomach turn, but she smiled back. This was survival. Smile, agree, make yourself invisible. After dinner, Trevor left without another word. Grace cleaned the kitchen, her movements automatic. When she finally climbed into bed alone, she pulled out the phone she'd hidden in her nightstand drawer. A separate phone Trevor didn't know about. She opened the voice memo app and began recording. "June 15th, Trevor grabbed my throat today when I asked about hotel charges on the credit card. I can still feel where his fingers pressed. The bruises are already forming." Her voice shook. "I'm scared. I'm 6 months pregnant, and I'm terrified of my own husband." She saved the recording with dozens of others. Evidence, insurance, a paper trail of her own destruction. Tomorrow she had brunch with her father. Tomorrow she would try to find the courage to tell him the truth. Tomorrow she promised herself everything would change. Sunday brunch at Marshall's favorite restaurant should have been Grace's salvation. She'd rehearsed what to say 100 times in her mind. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Trevor isn't who you think he is. I'm not safe." Simple words that felt impossible to speak. She sat across from her father in a sunlit booth, his weathered face breaking into smiles as he talked about department politics and upcoming budget meetings. Marshall Holloway had dedicated 30 years to protecting this city. His daughter was trying to find the courage to ask him to protect her. Trevor sat beside Grace, his hand resting possessively on her thigh beneath the table. To anyone watching, it looked affectionate. Grace felt his fingers digging into her leg hard enough to leave marks, a silent warning to keep her mouth shut. "You're quiet today, sweetheart," Marshall observed, studying his daughter over his coffee cup. "Everything okay?" This was the moment. Grace opened her mouth, the truth rising in her throat like bile. Trevor's fingers tightened painfully. "Just tired," Grace heard herself say. "The pregnancy has me exhausted." "You're doing too much," Marshall said, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe you should take leave early. Let your body rest." "I've been telling her the same thing," Trevor interjected smoothly. Grace has always been stubborn about taking care of herself, too dedicated to the realm. Marshall chuckled. "She gets that from her old man." He reached across the table to squeeze Grace's hand. "But serious, honey, your health and the baby's health come first." Grace nodded, her chance slipping away. Under the table, Trevor's grip finally loosened, satisfied that the danger had passed. Marshall's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "I'm sorry, I have to take this. Commissioner's been breathing down my neck about the West Side operation." He stepped away from the table, leaving Grace alone with Trevor. The moment Marshall was out of earshot, Trevor leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "Good girl, you made the right choice." Grace's hands trembled around her water glass. "Trevor, please, we need help. We need to talk to someone." "We don't need anything." He cut her off, his voice cold. "You keep your mouth shut, smile for your daddy, and remember that you'll never be safe from me. Not here, not anywhere. I own you." When Marshall returned, apologizing for the interruption, he found them sitting in tense silence. "Sorry about that," Marshall said, sliding back into the booth. "Where were we?" "Actually, Dad, Grace isn't feeling well," Trevor said before she could speak. "I think we should get her home to rest." Marshall's concerned gaze fell on his daughter. "You do look pale. Go on, get some rest. We'll do this again soon." Grace wanted to scream. Instead, she let Trevor guide her out of the restaurant, his hand firm on her lower back, controlling her every movement. The drive home was silent. Grace stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur past, feeling the walls of her cage closing in. She'd been so close to telling her father, so close to freedom. Now she was going home with the man who would never let her go. That afternoon, while Trevor was in his study on a conference call, Grace's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her blood turned cold as she read the headline, "Investment banker Trevor Caldwell spotted with mystery woman at downtown hotel." Below were photos, clear damning images of Trevor and a younger woman entering a luxury hotel, kissing in the lobby, his hands on her waist with the same possessive grip he used on Grace. The article identified the woman as Jenna Price, 26, a junior analyst at Trevor's firm. Grace's colleagues would see this. Her father would see this. Everyone would know that while she was 6 months pregnant, her husband was openly cheating. The humiliation was crushing. But beneath the shame, something else stirred. Anger. Cold, hard anger that cut through the fear she'd lived with for months. She screenshot the article and saved it to her hidden phone. More evidence for the file she was building. When Trevor emerged from his blinded study hours later, his face was thunderous. He'd clearly seen the article too. "Pack your things," he said coldly. Grace stared at him. "What?" "You heard me. Pack your things and get out. You've embarrassed me for the last time." "This is my father's house," Grace said, finding a spine she'd thought was broken. "You can't kick me out." Trevor's smile was cruel. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and tossed it on the coffee table. "Check the deed. I had your father transfer the house to my name last year. Remember when you signed those papers he said were for tax purposes?" Grace's hands shook as she opened the folder. There, in black and white, was her father's signature transferring the property entirely to Trevor Caldwell, and her own signature, witnessed and notarized, agreeing to the transfer. She'd signed it without reading, trusting her husband and father to handle the legal details. "You forged this," she whispered. "Prove it." Trevor crossed his arms, satisfied. "The house is mine. Everything is mine, including you. But since you can't seem to keep your mouth shut or your suspicions to yourself, maybe you need to learn what it really means to have nothing." Grace felt the world tilting beneath her. She'd thought she'd hit bottom before, but Trevor kept finding new depths to drag her to. "Where am I supposed to go?" Her voice sounded small, defeated. "That's not my problem." Trevor checked his watch. "You have 1 hour. Take what you can carry. Leave your credit cards and keys." Grace stood frozen, her mind racing. She could call her father, but what would she say? That she'd been too stupid to read documents before signing, that she'd let Trevor systematically strip away everything she owned. The shame was paralyzing. Trevor headed for the door. "I'm going to Jenna's place. When I come back, you better be gone." After he left, Grace sank onto the couch, her hands cradling her belly. Her baby kicked, oblivious to the disaster unfolding around them. She pulled out her hidden phone and called the only person she could think of. "Brennan Law Offices," a professional voice answered. "I need attorney Claire Brennan," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's an emergency. Domestic violence case." By the time Trevor returned that evening, Grace was still there. She hadn't packed. She hadn't left. Instead, she'd spent the afternoon with Claire Brennan, a specialist in domestic violence law who'd walked her through her options. "You have rights," Claire had told her. "Documentation, evidence, witnesses. We can fight this. You will fight this." When Trevor walked in and found Grace sitting calmly in the living room, his face contorted with rage. "I told you to leave." "This is my home," Grace said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." What happened next would change everything. Trevor's rage was a living thing, filling the room like toxic smoke. Grace had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was a man who'd lost control of his carefully constructed narrative. "You think you can defy me?" His voice was deadly quiet, which frightened her more than shouting would have. Grace stood her ground, one hand protectively on her belly. "I spoke with an attorney today, filed for divorce. Claire Brennan is representing me, and she says..." The slap came so fast she didn't see it. Her head snapped to the side, pain exploding across her cheek. She stumbled, catching herself on the arm of the couch. "You spoke to a lawyer." Trevor's voice climbed several octaves. You filed for divorce. Trevor, please. Grace tried to back away, but he followed, his face twisted with fury. After everything I've done for you, I made you respectable. I gave you status. You were just a cop's daughter before me. I'm still a cop's daughter, Grace said, tasting blood in her mouth. And I'm a detective in my own right. I don't need you to make me anything. The words were braver than she felt. Her entire body trembled. But something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was Claire Brennan's steady assurance that she deserved better. Maybe it was finally seeing Trevor's affair exposed. Maybe it was just exhaustion from living in fear. Whatever it was, Grace found herself unable to keep playing the victim. Trevor grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You're going to regret this. You're going to call that lawyer and tell her you made a mistake. No, Grace said simply. The word hung in the air between them. In 3 years of marriage, she'd never directly refused him before. Always found ways to deflect, to agree, to appease. Not anymore. Trevor's other hand shot out, shoving her hard. Grace stumbled backward, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. She reached for something to steady herself but found only air. The stairs. Time seemed to slow as Grace felt herself falling backward. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her belly, trying to protect the baby even as her own body tumbled down the concrete garage steps. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain through her. Her head hit the concrete floor with a sickening crack. The world went dark. When Grace opened her eyes, she was staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize. Fluorescent lights, the steady beep of monitors, chemical smell of hospital disinfectant. For one blissful moment, she forgot everything. Then the memories crashed back. Trevor, the fall, the baby. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Pain radiated through her skull. When she tried to speak, only a weak moan emerged. Grace, a familiar voice, thick with emotion. Oh, thank God, you're awake. Her father's face swam into view, haggard and pale. Marshall gripped her hand, his eyes red-rimmed. Dad, she managed to whisper. Don't try to talk. Sweetheart, you've been in a coma for 18 hours. The doctors weren't sure when you'd wake up. 18 hours. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her belly. Marshall saw the gesture and his expression softened. The baby's okay. Strong heartbeat. You're both fighters. Relief flooded through her, so intense it brought tears. The baby was safe. Whatever else had happened, her child had survived. Trevor said you fell down the stairs, Marshall continued, his voice carefully neutral. He's been here the whole time, refusing to leave your side. Grace's blood ran cold. Trevor was here, playing the concerned husband, spinning his version of events. She had to tell her father the truth, right now before Trevor could manipulate the situation further. Dad, she croaked, her throat raw. It wasn't. The door opened. Trevor walked in carrying coffee, his face the picture of concern and exhaustion. When he saw Grace awake, he rushed to her bedside. Grace, thank God. He reached for her hand, but she flinched away. Marshall noticed. Trevor noticed. The room suddenly felt too small. Give us a minute, Grace whispered to her father. Marshall hesitated, his cop instincts clearly firing, but respect for his daughter's privacy won out. I'll be right outside. He squeezed her hand once more, then left. The moment they were alone, Trevor's concerned expression vanished. Smart girl, he said quietly, setting down the coffee. You didn't say anything stupid to your father. This isn't over, Grace whispered, her voice gaining strength. I'm still filing for divorce. I'm still pressing charges. Trevor laughed, low and mean. With what evidence you fell down the stairs? Grace, pregnancy made you dizzy and you lost your balance. That's what everyone believes. That's what the medical report will say. I have recordings, Grace said. Photos, documentation going back months. His smile faltered for just a second. Where? Somewhere you'll never find them. Trevor leaned close, his breath hot against her face. Listen carefully. You will drop the divorce. You will tell that lawyer you made a mistake. And you will never, ever mention any recordings to anyone. Because if you do, I will make you disappear. You and that baby both. The threat hung in the air between them. Grace realized with crystallizing clarity that Trevor was capable of it. He'd already tried to kill her once, whether he'd intended to or not. Before she could respond, the door opened again. Detective Ryan Shaw entered, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Trevor immediately straightened, transforming back into the worried husband. "Grace, good to see you awake," Ryan said warmly, but his gaze was assessing. "I need to ask you a few questions about the accident. Standard procedure." This was her chance. Ryan was her colleague, someone who would believe her. All she had to do was tell the truth. Trevor's hand found hers under the blanket, squeezing hard enough to hurt. A reminder. A warning. "I fell," Grace heard herself say. "Lost my balance at the top of the stairs. Pregnancy has me dizzy sometimes." Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't believe her, muttered. Grace could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he studied Trevor with open suspicion. "Are you sure that's what happened?" Ryan pressed gently. Grace looked at her father standing in the doorway, at Trevor's threatening presence beside her bed, at the monitors tracking her baby's heartbeat. She was trapped. Trevor had made sure of it, and in that moment, lying broken in a hospital bed with her unborn child's life hanging in the balance, Grace made the hardest decision of her life. She would play dead, let Trevor think he'd won, build her case in secret, and when the time was right, she would take him down with everything she had. "I'm sure," she lied to Ryan. "It was just an accident," but her eyes said something different, and Ryan, trained to read between the lines, nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Get some rest. We'll talk more when you're feeling better." After he left, Grace closed her eyes and let the tears fall silently. She'd survived the fall. Now she had to survive what came next. 3 days after Grace woke from her coma, she was moved from intensive care to a private room in the maternity ward. The baby's heartbeat remained strong, and doctors were cautiously optimistic about both their recoveries. Trevor visited daily, playing his role perfectly. He brought flowers, held her hand for the nurses to see, and whispered threats when they were alone. "I'm watching you," he'd murmur while stroking her hair. "Every phone call, every visitor, every word you say. Remember what happens if you step out of line." Grace would nod, appearing defeated, but inside, her resolve hardened with each passing hour. On the 4th day, Detective Ryan Shaw returned. This time, he waited until Trevor left for a supposed meeting with his firm's attorneys. "Grace," Ryan said, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk. Really talk." Grace's heart raced. "Ryan, I told you what happened." "You lied." He pulled a chair close to her bed. "And I understand why. But I found something. Your locker at the precinct. There's a phone hidden in the false bottom." Grace's breath caught. She'd forgotten about that backup hiding place. "I didn't snoop through it," Ryan continued quickly, "but I recognized it wasn't your normal phone. Grace, if there's something on that device that can help you, now's the time to use it." Grace studied her colleague's face. She'd known Ryan for 5 years, worked cases with him, trusted him with her life in dangerous situations. Could she trust him with this? "Trevor has been abusing me for over a year," she whispered. "The fall wasn't an accident. He pushed me, and that phone has months of recordings, photos, evidence." Ryan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Shame, fear. My father thinks Trevor is perfect." Grace's voice broke. "How do I tell the police chief that I let this happen, that I was too weak to stop it?" "You're not weak," Ryan said firmly. "You're a survivor, and you're one of the best detectives I know. What you're experiencing is textbook domestic violence. The shame, the silence, the fear. None of that makes you weak." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "I have evidence, but Trevor threatened to kill me and the baby if I use it. Then we build a case he can't see coming." Ryan leaned forward. "I'll get that phone from your locker. We'll copy everything to a secure location, and we'll involve your father when we have enough to put Trevor away for good." "My father will kill him," Grace said simply. "When Marshall finds out what Trevor's done to me, he won't wait for the courts. Then we make sure the law moves fast enough that he doesn't have to." Ryan pulled out his own phone. "There's someone you should meet, Attorney Claire Brennan. She specializes in cases like yours." I already contacted her, Grace admitted. Before the fall, that's what triggered Trevor's attack. Then let's get her back on the case. You do. Ryan stood tall. I'm going to protect you, Grace. You're not alone in this anymore. After Ryan left, Grace felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but real. That night, while Trevor slept in the chair beside her bed, Grace's hidden phone buzzes silently under her pillow, a text from an unknown number. Phone retrieved, evidence secured, 23 recordings, 47 photos, detailed documentation. This is enough. We're building your case. Stay strong. R.S. Grace deleted the message and closed her eyes, her hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked rhythmically. She wasn't alone anymore, and Trevor had no idea what was coming. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jenna Price stood hesitantly in the doorway, looking younger and more uncertain than she had in the paparazzi photos. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, Jenna said quietly, but I needed to talk to you. While Trevor had stepped out to take a call in the hallway, Grace gestured for Jenna to enter, curiosity overriding anger. Why are you here? Grace asked. Jenna twisted her hands nervously. Because I need you to know the truth. Trevor told me you were separated, that you were emotionally unstable and had been for months. He said you were trying to trap him with the pregnancy, and you believed him. I wanted to, Jenna's eyes filled with tears, because believing him meant I wasn't the other woman. But then I saw you in that hospital bed, and I started asking questions. His coworkers, his friends, the stories didn't match up. So you're here to ease your conscience. Grace's voice held an edge. I'm here because I found something. Jenna pulled out her phone. Financial records. Trevor's been embezzling from the firm, $2 million over the past year, and he owes money to some very dangerous people. Grace's mind raced. Who? Victor Kane. He runs most of the illegal gambling in the city. Jenna's voice dropped to a whisper. Trevor's in deep, $500,000 in debt. I think he was planning to use your trust fund to pay it off. I don't have a trust fund, Grace said. You do. $5 million from your mother's life insurance. It becomes accessible when you turn 30 or in the event of your death. Jenna met Grace's eyes. Your birthday is next month, but if you died now, Trevor inherits everything as your husband. The implications hit Grace like a physical blow. Trevor hadn't just pushed her down the stairs in anger. He'd been trying to kill her. For money. Why are you telling me this? Grace asked. Because I'm not a murderer's accomplice. Jenna's voice shook. And because you deserve to know what kind of danger you're in. Trevor's desperate. Desperate men do terrible things. Before Grace could respond, Trevor's voice boomed from the hallway. What the hell are you doing here? Jenna paled but held her ground. Saying goodbye. I quit the firm today, and I'm done with you. She walked past Trevor without another glance, leaving him staring after her in shock. When Trevor turned back to Grace, his expression was murderous. But they weren't alone. A nurse had entered to check Grace's vitals. Her presence, a barrier against violence. Everything okay here? The nurse asked cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. Fine, Trevor said through gritted teeth. Just fine. But Grace saw the truth in his eyes. She'd just become exponentially more dangerous to him, and that meant she was running out of time. Detective Ryan Shaw sat in Police Chief Marshall Holloway's office at midnight, a laptop open between them. The station was quiet, only skeleton crew working the night shift. This conversation needed privacy. You're telling me my daughter has been systematically abused for over a year, and I missed every sign. Marshall's voice was barely above a whisper, but the pain in it could have shattered glass. She hid it because she loves you, Ryan said gently, because she knew how much it would hurt you to know. Marshall's hands trembled as Ryan played the first recording. Grace's voice, shaking but clear, June 15th. Trevor grabbed my throat today when I asked about hotel charges. I can still feel where his fingers pressed. The chief of police, a man who'd faced down armed criminals without flinching, wept openly as he listened to his daughter document her own suffering. 23 recordings later, Marshall's grief had transformed into cold fury. Where is he? His voice was deadly calm. Sir, we need to do this by the book. Ryan warned. If you go after him now, He almost killed her. He almost killed my grandchild. Marshall stood, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. Ryan moved to block the door. And he'll pay for it. But legally, we have enough to arrest him on multiple charges. Domestic violence, assault, attempted murder, plus Jenna Price came forward with evidence of embezzlement and fraud. Not enough, Marshall growled. I want him buried. What else do we have? Ryan pulled up another file. His financial records connect him to Victor Kane, gambling debts, loan shark operations. If we can get Kane to flip on Trevor, we can add conspiracy charges. Marshall's eyes narrowed. Kane's been a ghost for years, untouchable. Why would he flip now? Because Trevor owes him $500,000 and has no way to pay. Ryan leaned forward. Kane put out word on the street that he wants Trevor found. If we get to Trevor first, we can offer Kane a deal. Testimony against Trevor in exchange for reduced charges on other operations. It was risky. Using one criminal to catch another. But Marshall had spent 3 decades learning when to bend the rules for justice. Do it, he ordered. But Ryan, I want surveillance on Grace's hospital room 24/7. If Trevor so much as breathes wrong in her direction, already arranged. I've got 2 officers posted as medical personnel. Trevor won't get near her. Marshall nodded, his composure cracking again. How is she really stronger than you'd think? She wants to press charges herself, wants to face him in court. That's my girl. Pride mixed with sorrow in Marshall's voice. She gets that from her mother. Never back down from a fight. The laptop chimed. An email from the district attorney's office. Ryan opened it and smiled grimly. Warrant approved. We can arrest Trevor Caldwell on suspicion of domestic violence, assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, and fraud. Judge signed it an hour ago. Marshall stood, his badge catching the light. After 30 years in law enforcement, he'd learned to separate duty from emotion. But this was his daughter, his only child. The line between cop and father had never felt thinner. Assemble a team, he said. Quiet, people we trust. I want him in custody before sunrise. Ryan hesitated. Sir, you should recuse yourself from this case. Conflict of interest. I am recused, Marshall interrupted. Officially, your running point on this investigation. Detective Shaw, I'm just an old cop who happens to be in the office late doing paperwork. It was a thin pretense, and they both knew it, but Ryan nodded. Understood, sir. 2 hours later, a tactical team surrounded Trevor Caldwell's luxury apartment building. Ryan led the team personally, warrant in hand. They tracked Trevor's credit card to a penthouse registered under Jenna Price's name. Remembered, Ryan briefed his team. Suspect is considered dangerous. He has no known weapons, but he's desperate. By the book arrest. No mistakes. They breached the apartment at 4 a.m., found it empty except for packed suitcases and a trail of hastily abandoned belongings. Trevor had run. Ryan swore under his breath, pulling out his phone to call Marshall. He's gone. Cleared out maybe 2 hours ago. How did he know we were coming? Marshall's voice was tight. He didn't. But Jenna Price visiting Grace spooked him. He knows the walls are closing in. Ryan surveyed the apartment. We'll put out an APB, check airports, bus stations, his known associates. He's going after Grace. Marshall's certainty sent ice through Ryan's veins. If he's running anyway, he's got nothing to lose. And she's the only witness who can put him away for attempted murder. Ryan was already moving, his team falling in behind him. Get every available unit to Metro General, now. At the hospital, Grace slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by the sound of her own body hitting concrete. The 2 undercover officers stationed outside her door checked their weapons, alert but calm. They didn't see the orderly pushing a medical cart down the hall, didn't recognize the face hidden behind a surgical mask and scrubs. Trevor Caldwell had spent enough time at the hospital to learn its routines. He knew when shift changes happened, when security made their rounds, where the blind spots in camera coverage existed, and he knew exactly which medications would stop his pregnant wife's heart without leaving obvious traces. The orderly paused at the nurse's station, chatting casually with the night nurse while palming a syringe from the cart. Professional, practiced, invisible. Then he moved toward Grace's room, the undercover officer stationed closest to Grace's door, Detective Maria Santos, felt her instincts prickle as the orderly approached. Something about his gait seemed wrong. too purposeful, too focused. "Excuse me," she called out, stepping into his path. "I haven't seen you on this floor before." The orderly kept his head down, mask obscuring most of his face. "New transfer. Night shift. Name and badge number." Maria's hand moved subtly toward her concealed weapon. The orderly's eyes flicked toward Grace's door, then back to Maria. In that microsecond of hesitation, recognition flashed. "Trevor Caldwell, freeze," Maria shouted, drawing her weapon. Trevor dropped the medical cart and lunged not away from the officers, but toward Grace's room. His hand closed on the door handle just as Maria tackled him from behind. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The syringe skittered across the tile, its contents spilling harmlessly. Trevor fought with the desperate strength of a cornered animal, landing a solid punch to Maria's jaw before her partner, Officer James Park, joined the fray. "Grace," Trevor screamed as they forced him face down. "This is all your fault. You ruined everything." Inside her room, Grace jerked awake to the sound of chaos. She saw flashing badges, her husband's face pressed against the floor, his eyes wild with hate fixed on her through the doorway. "You were supposed to die," Trevor shouted as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "The fall should have killed you. You should have just died." The confession echoed through the corridor. Half a dozen witnesses heard it, including the night nurse frantically calling security. Grace sat frozen in her hospital bed, one hand protectively covering her belly, watching her husband finally reveal his true nature to the world. Detective Ryan Shaw arrived minutes later, breathing hard from sprinting through the hospital. He took in the scene, Trevor in handcuffs, the spilled syringe being photographed as evidence. Grace pale but alive in her doorway. "What was in the syringe?" Ryan demanded. "Potassium chloride," Maria reported, still holding her bruised jaw. "Enough to cause cardiac arrest. Make it look like pregnancy complications." Ryan's hands clenched into fists. Trevor had come here to murder Grace and make it look natural. If Maria's instincts had been even a few seconds slower— "Trevor Caldwell," Ryan said formally, reading from a card, though he'd memorized the words years ago. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, domestic violence, fraud, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." "You can't prove anything," Trevor spat. "That syringe could have been for anyone. This is harassment because you're all protecting her. We have 23 recordings of you threatening and assaulting your wife," Ryan said coldly. 47 photographs documenting abuse, financial records showing you embezzled $2 million, and about a dozen witnesses who just heard you confess to pushing her down the stairs. The color drained from Trevor's face. "Oh, and Victor Kane sends his regards," Ryan added. "He's very interested in having a conversation with you about the money you owe him. We might be able to arrange that in prison." Trevor's composure finally shattered. He lunged toward Grace again, screaming obscenities until officers forcibly dragged him away. In the sudden silence, Grace found herself face to face with her father. Marshall Holloway stood in the corridor, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Gracie," he whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you." Grace stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her father. They stood there in the fluorescent hospital lighting, both crying, both holding each other up. "It's not your fault, Dad," Grace said softly. "I hid it from you. I was ashamed." "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Marshall pulled back to look at his daughter. "You survived. And now we're going to make sure he pays for every second of what he put you through." Ryan approached quietly. "Grace, we need your statement. Everything that happened, in your own words. Are you ready?" Grace took a deep breath, her hands still resting on her belly where her daughter kicked steadily. Her child would be born into a world where her mother stood up and fought back, where justice, however imperfect, still meant something. "I'm ready," Grace said. She spent the next 4 hours giving her statement. Every detail, every assault, every threat. The words came easier than she'd imagined, as if speaking them aloud finally released their power over her. When she finished, dawn was breaking over the city. Grace watched pink light creep across the hospital room walls, feeling lighter than she had in months. "What happens now?" she asked Ryan. "Now we build the case, with your testimony, the recordings, the financial evidence, and his attempted murder tonight. Trevor's looking at 20 to 30 years minimum. He'll fight it, Grace said. Let him try. Ryan's smile was grim. Every lawyer in the city has seen the news by now. Trevor Caldwell arrested trying to murder his pregnant wife with a lethal injection. He's already convicted in the court of public opinion. Marshall re-entered the room carrying coffee and breakfast. I called your attorney, Claire Brennan. She's filing an emergency protective order and expediting the divorce. Trevor won't be able to contact you or come within 500 feet once he makes bail. Will he make bail? Grace asked. Not if I have anything to say about it. Marshall replied. The DA is arguing he's a flight risk and danger to the community. Judge will likely agree. Grace nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But beneath the fatigue was something new. Peace. The secret was out. The truth was known. She didn't have to carry this alone anymore. Get some rest, Ryan said gently. You've been through enough for one night. After they left, Grace lay back in her hospital bed and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she slept without nightmares. The arrest of Trevor Caldwell became the city's biggest story overnight. Every news outlet ran the footage of him being led from Metro General in handcuffs, shouting threats. The narrative they'd all believed successful banker with pregnant wife had been exposed as a lie. Grace's phone exploded with messages of support from colleagues, friends, even strangers who'd followed the story. The outpouring was overwhelming and humbling. But the legal battle was just beginning. Trevor hired Marcus Webb, a notorious defense attorney known for getting wealthy clients acquitted through aggressive tactics. Webb immediately went on the offensive, painting Grace as an unstable woman seeking revenge for her husband's affair. My client made mistakes in his marriage, Webb told reporters outside the courthouse. But being a bad husband doesn't make him a criminal. Detective Holloway's accusations are fabricated, motivated by jealousy and emotional instability during a difficult pregnancy. The smear campaign was calculated and vicious. Webb leaked carefully edited portions of Grace's therapy records from years earlier, when she'd sought counseling after her mother's death. He twisted her grief into evidence of mental illness. Claire Brennan countered immediately. Mr. Webb is engaging in classic victim blaming. Detective Holloway has 23 audio recordings of her husband's abuse, photographic evidence, medical records, and multiple witnesses. The only thing unstable here is his client's defense strategy. The preliminary hearing became a media circus. Grace sat in the courtroom, 6 months pregnant and visibly nervous, while Trevor's lawyer tried to dismantle her credibility. Detective Holloway, isn't it true you've taken anxiety medication in the past? Webb asked. Yes, after my mother died when I was 19, Grace answered steadily. And isn't it true you've had conflicts with your husband about your work schedule? What married couple doesn't have conflicts? Grace kept her voice level despite her racing heart. Webb paced dramatically. Isn't it possible that in your emotionally fragile state, you've exaggerated normal marital disagreements into something more sinister? No, Grace said firmly. I have recordings of my husband choking me, photographs of bruises, and a traumatic brain injury from when he pushed me down the stairs. Those aren't exaggerations. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Morrison, interrupted. Mr. Webb, do you have evidence suggesting these recordings are fabricated? Webb hesitated. We're having them analyzed. Until you do, stop wasting the court's time. Judge Morrison turned to the prosecution. Continue. The district attorney, a sharp young woman named Andrea Martinez, played 3 of the most damning recordings. Trevor's voice filled the courtroom, cold and cruel, threatening to kill Grace if she left him. Trevor's face remained impassive, but Grace saw his hands trembling slightly. The mask was slipping. Over the next week, the case against Trevor expanded. Forensic accountants traced his embezzlement. The FBI got involved when they discovered Trevor had been laundering money for Victor Kane's organization. Jenna Price testified about Trevor's lies and manipulation, describing how he'd told her Grace was mentally unstable and had trapped him with the pregnancy. He said he was planning to divorce her after the baby was born. Jenna told the court, her voice steady, that he was just waiting for the right time. I believed him because I wanted to. The turning point came when Victor Kane himself, facing federal racketeering charges, agreed to testify against Trevor in exchange for a reduced sentence. Kane, a gray-haired man in his 60s who looked more like a banker than a crime boss, told the court how Trevor had borrowed money to cover gambling debts and embezzlement. He owed me $500,000, Kane said flatly. When I asked for repayment, he told me his wife had a trust fund worth $5 million, said he'd have access to it soon. I didn't ask questions. Did he specify how he'd gain access? Andrea Martinez asked. Kane's cold gaze found Trevor across the courtroom. He said his wife wouldn't be a problem much longer. I assumed he meant divorce. Now I realize he meant something else. The implication hung heavy in the air. Trevor had told a known criminal that his pregnant wife wouldn't be a problem. Then weeks later, she'd fallen down the stairs and nearly died. Judge Morrison denied bail. Trevor would remain in custody pending trial. Outside the courthouse, Grace stood beside her father and Claire Brennan, facing a wall of cameras and reporters. I want to say something. Grace spoke into the microphones, her voice steady despite her nerves. To anyone out there living in fear of someone who's supposed to love them, it's not your fault. The shame, the silence, the feeling that you somehow deserve this, none of it is true, Wano. You deserve safety. You deserve respect. And there are people who will help you if you find the courage to speak. The clip went viral. Grace became the face of domestic violence survivors who fought back. Her inbox filled with messages from women and men sharing their own stories. But in a county jail cell, Trevor watched the news coverage and plotted revenge. 3 months later, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Emma Grace Holloway, using her maiden name. Trevor's parental rights were legally terminated while he awaited trial. The birth had been difficult, complications from the injuries she'd sustained during the fall. But when the nurses placed Emma in her arms, Grace felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her that made every moment of pain worthwhile. This tiny, perfect person would never know the fear her mother had lived with. Grace would make sure of that. Marshall had been in the delivery room, holding his daughter's hand through every contraction, tears streaming down his face when he first held his granddaughter. She has your mother's eyes, he'd whispered. And Grace had wept at the bittersweet reminder of all the women in her family who'd survived their own battles. The trial began on a cold November morning. The courthouse was packed with reporters, advocates, and citizens who'd followed the case obsessively. Security had been doubled after Trevor's attorney received death threats from people outraged by the details emerging in pretrial hearings. Grace testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through her marriage in excruciating detail. She showed them photographs of bruises, played the recordings, and described the moment Trevor pushed her down the stairs. Claire Brennan had prepared her well, warning her that reliving the trauma would be brutal. But nothing could have fully prepared Grace for the experience of speaking those truths aloud in a room full of strangers, of watching jurors' faces crumple with sympathy and anger, of feeling Trevor's cold stare boring into her from the defense table. I remember thinking, this is it, she said quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to where Emma sat in the gallery with Marshall. I'm going to die, and my baby is going to die, and no one will ever know the truth. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. One older woman in the back row openly wept. Trevor's defense tried to paint him as a man driven to desperation by a controlling wife and demanding father-in-law. Marcus Webb brought up every argument Grace and Trevor had ever had, twisted every conversation into evidence of her allegedly manipulative behavior. Isn't it true you threatened to tell your father about the affair if Trevor didn't end it? Webb asked during cross-examination. No, Grace said firmly. I never threatened him. I asked him to go to counseling with me. He responded by choking me until I nearly passed out. Webb tried a different angle. You've admitted to recording your husband without his knowledge. Isn't that a violation of trust? I was documenting abuse, Grace replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Those recordings saved my life. They're the only reason anyone believes me now. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical experts testified that Grace's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. The pattern suggested she'd been pushed with significant force. A biomechanics specialist recreated the fall using computer models, demonstrating that the trajectory and impact points could only occur if someone had shoved her backward. Ryan Shaw detailed the night Trevor infiltrated the hospital to inject Grace with potassium chloride, describing how close he'd come to committing the perfect murder. The syringe itself was entered into evidence, the lethal dose of medication still visible in the chamber. Detective Maria Santos, who'd tackled Trevor that night, testified about his screaming confession in the hospital corridor. He said, you were supposed to die. The fall should have killed you. Those were his exact words, witnessed by myself, Officer Park, 3 nurses, and 2 patients in the hallway. When Trevor took the stand in his own defense against his lawyer's advice, he made everything worse. I loved my wife, he insisted, his voice carrying the same practiced sincerity that had fooled so many people for so long. Everything I did was because I cared about her. You cared about her so much you were sleeping with Jenna Price, Andrea Martinez asked, her tone sharp as a scalpel. That was a mistake. Men make mistakes. You cared about her so much you embezzled $2 million and planned to use her trust fund to pay your gambling debts. I was trying to provide for our family. You cared about her so much you pushed her down the stairs while she was pregnant with your child. That's not what happened. Then explain the recordings where you threatened to kill her if she left you. Trevor's composure finally cracked. His face flushed red, the charming mask slipping to reveal the rage beneath. She deserved everything she got. She wouldn't listen, wouldn't obey, wouldn't be the wife I needed. I gave her everything and she threw it back in my face. The courtroom erupted. Gasps and shouts filled the air. Judge Morrison gavelled for order while Trevor's lawyer frantically tried to do damage control. But it was too late. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess, Webb began. Denied, Judge Morrison said coldly. Your client just confessed to abuse on the stand. Continue, Sus. Martinez. Andrea Martinez stood, her expression grim but satisfied. No further questions. Your Honor, the defendant has told us everything we need to know. But the damage was done. Trevor had revealed himself completely, stripping away any last shred of doubt about his guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was steady and clear. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Grace felt her father's hand squeeze her shoulder, felt Claire Brennan's reassuring presence beside her, felt the weight of 3 years of terror finally lifting from her chest. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Morrison addressed Trevor directly. You terrorized your wife, attempted to murder her and your unborn child, and showed no remorse whatsoever, even in this courtroom. You blamed the victim for your own violent actions. You represent everything our justice system stands against. She sentenced him to 30 years without possibility of parole. Trevor was led away screaming threats and obscenities, his final performance as uncontrolled and ugly as everything he'd hidden behind closed doors. Grace watched him go, feeling nothing but relief and a quiet sense of closure. Outside the courthouse, she held Emma in her arms while addressing the cameras one final time. Her daughter cooed softly, oblivious to the significance of the moment. Justice isn't always perfect, Grace said, her voice carrying across the crowded courthouse steps. But today it worked. Today a dangerous man was held accountable for his actions. And today I can finally say I'm free. Marshall stood beside his daughter, his arm around her shoulders, pride and relief evident in every line of his weathered face. Ryan stood on her other side, ever the protective presence, ready to shield Grace and Emma from the press of cameras if needed. The cameras captured the moment 3 generations bound by love and survival, Grace, her father, and her daughter, facing a future Trevor could never touch again. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Grace whispered to Emma, "You'll never have to be afraid, and I promise you that." It was a promise she intended to keep. 2 years later, Grace stood in her new kitchen, watching Emma toddle around the living room. At 2 years old, her daughter was fearless, curious, and joyful everything Grace had hoped she could be. The house was smaller than the one she'd shared with Trevor, but it was truly hers, bought with her own money, decorated according to her own taste, filled with laughter and light. She'd returned to work 6 months after Emma was born, despite her father's protests that she should take more time. But Grace needed to reclaim that part of herself, the detective who solved cases and helped victims, the woman who was more than just a survivor of violence. Her phone rang. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she answered, smiling. "Hey yourself. You still good for dinner tonight?" "Wouldn't miss it. Emma's been asking about Uncle Ryan all day." There was warmth in Ryan's laugh. Over the past 2 years, their friendship had deepened into something more. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just steady, patient, real. I have news, Ryan said. Trevor's appeal was denied. Again. That's the third time Grace absorbed this. Some part of her had feared Trevor would find a way out, would come back into her life. But the system was holding. Good, she said simply. How are you feeling about it? Grace considered the question. 2 years ago, she would have been consumed by fear. Now she felt something different. Not quite indifference, but a healthy distance from the trauma. I feel okay, she said honestly. He can't hurt me anymore. That's enough. After they hung up, Grace thought about the universal truth her experience had taught her, that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself to them, that asking for help isn't weakness, that survival is its own form of strength. She thought about all the women who'd reached out to her after the trial, sharing their own stories of abuse and escape. Grace had started volunteering with a domestic violence advocacy group, using her experience to help others find their way out of dangerous situations. Mama, Emma called, holding up a toy triumphantly. Grace scooped up her daughter, breathing in her baby shampoo smell, feeling the solid weight of her in her arms. This beautiful, perfect child who would grow up knowing her mother was strong, who would learn that love meant safety, not control. Marshall arrived for his weekly visit, bringing pizza and toys for Emma. At 60, he'd finally started talking about retirement, though Grace suspected he'd never fully step away from the job. They ate dinner together, the three of them plus Ryan, who showed up with flowers and made Emma giggle with his terrible magic tricks. It wasn't the family Grace had imagined when she married Trevor. It was better. After Emma was asleep, Grace stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the question so many people had asked her. How do you move on from something like that? The truth was, you didn't move on. You moved forward, carrying your scars but refusing to let them define you. You built a new life, one small choice at a time. You learned to trust again, slowly and carefully. You forgave yourself for the parts that hurt to remember, and you found meaning in the survival, purpose in the pain. Grace's phone buzzed with a message from Claire Brennan. Another client wants to meet you. Young mother, similar situation. Would you be willing to talk to her? Grace typed back immediately, yes, send me her information. Because that was the thing about surviving. It gave you the power to help others do the same. Ryan joined her on the porch, 2 glasses of wine in hand. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. Do you ever regret it? Ryan asked softly. Going through with the trial, making it all public. Grace considered. The trial had been brutal, the media attention invasive, the judgment from strangers painful. No, she said, because staying silent would have meant letting him win, and I didn't survive everything I survived just to live in fear. Ryan nodded, understanding without needing more words. I'm proud of you, he said simply. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of someone who'd proven his trustworthiness through actions, not words. I'm proud of me too, she replied, and she meant it, not in an arrogant way, but in the profound realization that she'd faced the worst another person could do to her and emerged on the other side. Scarred but whole, Emma would grow up hearing the story age appropriately. Of course, but she would know her mother was a fighter, that monsters existed but could be defeated, that justice, however imperfect, was worth pursuing. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Grace went back inside to her daughter, her father, and the man who'd waited patiently for her to be ready for something new. She'd survived the fall. She'd survived the fear. She'd survived the fight. Now she was learning something even harder, how to simply live. And for the first time in years, Grace Holloway looked toward the future and felt not fear, but hope.